Imagine walking into your local supermarket. You grab a block of cheese, look at the price, you blink again, and then instead of quietly complaining to yourself, you gather hundreds of people, chase the merchants through town, and start a riot over cheese. Sounds ridiculous and mega unrealistic? Well, in 1766, that's pretty much what happened. This is the story of the Nottingham Cheese Riot, one of England's most ridiculous historical events. An event that had angry crowds, panicked merchants, and a desperate mayor, and a wheel of cheese that briefly became Nottingham's most dangerous criminal. With that being said, let us begin. Now, to understand this story, we need to make something clear.
So let me be clear.
In the year 1766, life wasn't exactly what you would call easy. There was no Walmart, no Tesco, no food delivery apps of any kind, and so if food prices dramatically increased, ordinary people would feel it almost immediately, much like a punch to the face. And in the mid-1700s, Britain in particular was facing massive food shortages and high prices. Bad harvests had hurt supply, and food was becoming more expensive. And so because of all this madness, people understandably became very frustrated very quickly. Now, among the many foods that people cared about more than any other, cheese was one of the top ones, because it was cheap, it lasted a long time, and probably best of all, it provided natural nutrition. This wasn't luxury food. For these people, it was everyday survival. Which meant when the cheese prices in particular started rising, people noticed very quickly. Now, from the perspective of local merchants, things looked quite different for them. They saw opportunity. Cheese could be bought locally and sold elsewhere for a higher profit. Simple, perfectly legal, and most of all, perfectly normal in their eyes. Unfortunately for these merchants though, the people of Nottingham didn't quite see it the same way. Big surprise there. Every cart being rolled through the town felt like food being taken away from local families. And every wheel of cheese being exported elsewhere meant one thing: higher prices. And so pretty quickly, the tension began. Week after week, month after month, people would start to complain, and people would get very angry and begin arguing with local authorities. However, all that frustration would soon explode all at once in one day at Nottingham's biggest event, the Goose Fair. Now, to give you a bit of an idea of what the Goose Fair was, it wasn't exactly what you would call a small local market. The Goose Fair was one of the biggest events of the year. People travelled miles to attend, merchants sold goods here that couldn't be sold at any other market. It was massive for its time. To put it bluntly, because of the Goose Fair, the town would be fully packed with people. And in October of 1766, the atmosphere felt very weird before the event had even begun. Whispers spread, food prices going higher and higher, people getting very frustrated, in particular with the price of cheese. And so for the local merchants, they arrived thinking that they were about to make a ton of money. However, what they had arrived into was actually more like a ticking time bomb. At first, things were relatively normal, and as to be expected, keyword there, relatively. There were arguments, complaints, shouting, all the right ingredients to make history interesting. The crowd accused the merchants of driving prices higher, and the merchants would respond to these people by basically saying, "Dude, I've got to make my money, I'm just doing my job, leave me alone." The point is neither side wanted to back down, until finally somebody in the crowd lost their patience. And this is usually the part where history becomes very fun, very quick. Before long, members of the crowd were literally stopping merchants from leaving the town and seizing their carts full of cheese. It was madness. But then things actually got a little bit strange as well, because once the crowd would steal these massive blocks and wheels of cheese, instead of just taking it and running away, which is what you and me would probably expect people of those times to do, no, they didn't do that. Instead, they took the cheese and started selling it to other members of the public themselves, but they sold it for a much cheaper and reasonable price, at least a price that agreed with their mind. Think of it like this. Imagine you walk into your local supermarket, you enter the dairy aisle, and you just announce to everyone in the supermarket, "Ladies and gentlemen, after careful consideration, I've decided to adjust the cheese prices." because I can. That's essentially what happened in this situation, and so for that reason, it's quite funny. The crowd saw themselves correcting a massive injustice done to their town, the merchants saw themselves being robbed, and the local authorities just witnessed massive chaos unfolding in front of them. Now this is where things get a bit interesting and funny though, because the town's mayor at this point in time, who was a guy called Robbie Swan, things were not looking good for him as the town's mayor. Because put it this way, he's allowing all these merchants to come into his town and drive these cheese prices through the roof, and now all of a sudden at the biggest event of the year within his town is total chaos happening all around him. And the crowd, they're not exactly on his side here. So in other words, he's fucked. However, pretty soon it wasn't just the crowd the mayor would have to protect himself from, because the merchants who were being robbed now came forward to him and demanded protection over their product. Arguments were very quickly becoming confrontations between the public and the merchants, and so just everyone was relying on this one man, the Mayor of Nottingham, to fix all these problems himself. Just imagine being this guy for 2 seconds. You wake up expecting a great day, a great event that you're hosting within your beautiful town, you're expecting to make quite a bit of money for yourself and your town, and then all of a sudden, by lunchtime, you're finding yourself in a full-scale dairy uprising. Bet he didn't have that on his to-do list. However, as tensions continued rising, the chaos finally boiled over, and somehow got worse. What started as a few complaints about food prices from local families had turned into a full-scale riot. Large angry crowds filled the streets, merchants failed to protect their stock, and worst of all, authorities struggled to maintain order. Cheese was being moved, seized, and sold all over the town. At this point, I think it's fair to say that Nottingham quickly became the setting of the world's strangest action movie. Just imagine explaining this to anyone from any other town, city, country, you name it, at this point in time. Help us, we're having a riot. Why? Cheese! Are we being serious? I tell you what though, as much as I'm talking about this, it is making me wonder what it must have been like to actually be in the street witnessing this massive, ridiculous event unfolding all around you. Just think about it. There's angry crowds chasing each other through the streets, trying to steal and sell cheese to one another. There's angry merchants who are being robbed and seized left, right and centre. You've got a mayor who's probably sat in the middle of a street with his head between his legs, crying like a 6-year-old girl. The authorities are there, but they can't really do much because no one gives a shit. And there's also wheels of cheese just being rolled through the streets of Nottingham. It must have been madness. A bit like if it was the Purge, but instead of killing people, it's people fighting over cheese. Everything was madness, everything was blatant confusion, until eventually history had one of its best moments ever, in my personal opinion. This is the moment that ensured this story would be told, not decades, but centuries after the actual event took place. Because during all this chaos, one of those big wheels of cheese I told you about that was rolling through the streets of Nottingham accidentally broke loose from the people trying to steal it. And it just started rolling down this slope. People were running away, people were shouting, people were screaming, the authorities were trying to maintain order, weren't really doing a great job, but they were trying their best, and unfortunately for Nottingham's mayor, the cheese had apparently selected its target. Because according to accounts of witnesses at the actual cheese riot, that wheel of cheese actually rolled and struck the Mayor of Nottingham, knocking him over. Let me say that again, in this way. The Mayor of Nottingham was taken out by cheese. Not a rioter, not a merchant, not a criminal of any sorts, just a wheel of cheese. Somewhere in Nottingham, a giant wheel of cheese effectively became the most lethal weapon and thing in general in this massive historical event. Honestly, if I were Robbie Swan at this point in time, I'd probably just have to change my name and move to a different country. Never mind to a different town, you'd need to move to a different country. Preferably Australia, because that's very far away. Because how could you explain that to your doctor after being injured by the cheese? Sir, how did you get this injury? I got it from cheese. No, seriously, how'd you get it? Cheese. Yeah, right. Now, as you can see from me, it is very easy to laugh at this story. It's so utterly ridiculous that this actually happened. And so because of that, it's okay to laugh. But underneath all this comedy and funny side to this story, there was a real problem here. Because people weren't complaining because of cheese. Although cheese was the main cause of the riots, it wasn't because people just loved cheese. Although some might have. But the real issue of the riots and the reason people were so angry with the current government was because of affordability in general. The cheese was merely the symbol, the thing that would make people rise up and say, that's enough. And throughout history, when people feel they can't afford natural necessities, tensions rise fairly quickly, as we've now seen. And eventually, those tensions explode into madness. Sometimes tragically, sometimes terribly, and occasionally they cause a runaway dairy product to take out the mayor of its town. Eventually though, all this madness did start to die down when the local authorities began gaining order of the town once again, ending this riot for good. The people survived, the merchants survived, and most of all, the cheese survived. And slowly but surely, life returned to normal. But this wasn't exactly something that history could just forget about. No way. It's too good. Most riots are forgotten, most protests fade away, but a riot containing a runaway massive wheel of cheese that struck and injured the mayor of its town, that's a story that people will remember for centuries, especially as we're here talking about it 250 years later. The Nottingham Cheese Riot continues and probably always will be known as Britain's most ridiculous historical event. A story that sounds completely fictional, a riot that sounds like a comedy sketch, and proof that history is far stranger and random than any writer could predict. Because while modern history books are filled with kings, queens, wars, castles, you name it, sometimes the most memorable stories are the stupidest ones. Sometimes the most memorable stories are simply this. A crowd became frustrated due to cheese prices, a riot broke out, people fought, a few people even died, and an angry mayor was squished by a giant wheel of cheese. And honestly, that's why I personally love history, because no screenwriter would dare write that. Reality did it anyway.